Hello humans, welcome to The Front Line, a leadership and business podcast brought to you by Peregrine Corporate Services, an Isle of Man-based fiduciary provider. My name is Martin Hall, and thanks for listening. In this podcast, we chat to an array of business leaders from different sectors to learn more about them, their market, skill sets and knowledge. We hope you enjoy. Today I'm joined by Sinead. Thanks for joining me today.
No worries.
So perhaps provide our listeners a little bit of background to where you grew up, your early education and...
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Northern Ireland, as you can probably tell from the accent, from County Down. So when I go to Peel, I can stand on the beach and wave and look over at the moors. That's absolutely where I grew up, was educated, went to the University of Ulster at Coleraine, did a degree in European Business Studies with French. Spent a year of that working, 6 months working in Holiday Inn worldwide in Brussels, which was amazing, and 6 months at university in Angers in the Loire Valley, which was also amazing. So the whole degree was targeted towards graduating in 1992, year of the single market. We were all going to go to Brussels and work for the European Commission, etc. And I got as far as the Isle of Man, but always wanted to come here because during my university holidays, I used to work here as a waitress and a chambermaid in the hotels.
Okay.
And growing up in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, I guess subconsciously, I just thought this is a really nice place to be.
What was that first step that brought you here? Sometimes it's family or what was?
I kind of
beaches.
As my mother would say, where the heart lies, the feet wander. I met my son's father here.
Okay.
And moved here just after I graduated.
Right.
As I say, much to the disappointment of my parents at the time, who I think thought I was destined for a career in Brussels. I think they're okay with me now, but so I've always loved it. So I've either lived in Northern Ireland or lived on the Isle of Man. So yeah.
And the studies, what made you go down that route of languages?
Always loved languages.
Okay.
I got top A in Northern Ireland in my English language O-level. So I've always been had an affinity with language, and when I started grammar school, I remember getting my French textbook on the first day and bringing it home at the weekend because I went to boarding school, and reading it from cover to cover and just falling in love with French. So that was always. I did Irish as well. So at my school it was mandatory to do Irish to O-level. I took it on to A-level. So there's a little bit still left, but not a lot.
I was going to say, do you know many of those still? Could you go France and be?
I could. France I
blend
would be
in.
Comfortable with. The Gaeltacht area of Ireland, maybe not so much. France I would feel comfortable with still, because going to university and attending lectures in French, having to do a French dissertation, it just kind of gets in your blood and stays there. So I regret not having a role that involves my French, but it was one of those things.
I did a podcast recently with someone and they were similar. They'd done languages and they actually found how helpful it was as part of those studies was learning cultures from I suppose living and learning in those places as well that they now use in their business now, just knowing the different cultures and how they how they
and
are.
It was a great experience, living for 6 months in France and then another 6 months in Brussels was fabulous.
I'm sure.
Really great time in my life.
You mentioned then you came to the island and started working on the island.
Yes.
What was your first sort of main job, and was that just a job for the sake of getting a job, or did you have a career in mind?
My dad told me that if I didn't have a job in 6 months, I had to come home.
Oh, right.
So I had a very early foray into advertising sales.
Okay.
With the old Manx Independent, which got bought over by Isle of Man newspapers. That wasn't a career for me. And then during that time, Eagle Star, as it was then, was recruiting, and I went along to an open evening, and then when I got made redundant, when Manx Independent was bought out, I wrote to Eagle Star and said, I'm free now, in my naivety. And thankfully Eagle Star said, that's good to know, come and work for us. So my first real financial services job was in the new business team in Eagle Star, and I eventually ended up in the UK team, which coincided with key features and cancellation notices coming in the UK. And so this was in the really old days of the PIA in the UK, and I was the new business link to the project team that was working on cancellation notices and the like. And that was my first interface with compliance and my first love affair with compliance.
I wouldn't admit that.
Ooh, a rule book. And yeah, so after that, I really wanted to move into compliance. There weren't any opportunities at Eagle Star. So
can I ask at that stage, obviously now, say compliance rules the world, but it's so dominant. Is that something, looking back, you'd ever envisage where we are now with it?
No, never. I mean, this was in 1995, and my first compliance job at Sun Life, the compliance function was completely in its infancy. I was really lucky to work for a guy who had done compliance in the UK, and I credit him with teaching me a lot of what I still use today in terms of bringing compliance to life for people. So it was a real baptism of fire. And we didn't have the internet in those days. So, my first task was to write churning procedures and anti-money laundering procedures. And I was like, I don't even know what those things are. I've never heard of them. We didn't get KYC in those days. We might have got a copy of a passport to put age admitted yes on a policy document, but that was about it. So that was really, educational and instructive.
We do chat to people about looking back at mentors, and sometimes good just to sort of stop wherever you are in your career and go and look how people impacted your career. Absolutely,
and Keith was one of those people that I learned a huge amount of, and we're still in touch today, thankfully. So he was very educational, and it's funny how one of my mottos in life is create your own luck, and I did that by writing to Eagle Star. And when I was at Sun Life in the early weeks that I was there, we engaged KPMG to come in and do a compliance review, and I was really sort of curious as to what they did, and they said, we come in, we look at what you're doing, we tell you where your weak spots are, and we go home again. And I was like, that's quite interesting. I want to do that one day.
Right, okay.
So when I got to the stage at Sun Life where I felt I wanted to move on, sorry Keith, in case you're listening, I wrote to KPMG.
Right.
And I said, I'd like to come and work for you. And thankfully they said yes.
Goes back though, doesn't create your own luck rather than kind of being passive and waiting for it to land on your desk.
Luck is a huge motto of mine. So I joined there in 1999 into regulatory and compliance advisory role. Stayed there for 15 years.
All right.
And then 6 years ago.
So, in that role, what was the day-to-day? Was that out to advise clients or working internally within the business, or both?
It was very much client facing, and it was very new, and we had some great mentors again. I worked for David McGarry, I worked for Mike Field, and they taught me so much in terms of standard of client care, standard of work. I still write today the way David taught me how to write. So it was really great. We put some really great products together that were so ahead of their time. Like we had a site for MROs way before the internet was really a thing. So it was great, brilliant experience. And towards the end of my career there, I was involved with the Gibraltar office, and we were a centre of excellence for AML within the KPMG inter-island community, if you like. So I travelled to Turks, to Bahamas, to BVI to provide MLRO type seminars. Fabulous time, and learnt a huge amount.
And then you mentioned there you then move on to Doherty Quinn. I imagine it was then back then rather than DQ.
It was Doherty Quinn, and it's now DQ Advocates. Some people still welded to calling us Doherty Quinn. But that was a huge transition for me, because I'd been at KPMG for 15 years, and people thought that I would be there till I retired, and I kind of thought that myself. And my life plan was work in KPMG till I'm was 50 and then go and work in Marks and Spencer's. And then DQ came along and kind of interrupted that plan.
What was appealing about that opportunity?
I knew them. I'd worked with them already. I thought they were a nice group. I guess, time at KPMG was, going on and things were just sort of the same. And this gave me an opportunity to change later on in my life, which doesn't often come around. And I liked the fact that DQ as a law firm were thinking, yeah, we could do this regulatory compliance advisory stuff. I like that. We're a very ambitious firm. We like being different from the rest. And that was DQ's, I think, first step into being markedly different from the rest. For me, for my clients, it offers a one-stop shop between compliance advisory and legal services, whereas previously we would have had to say, you need to speak to your advocates about that. Now we can just seamlessly work for the client across all the practice areas, and I think the clients really benefit from that, and I think the advocates benefit the other way around.
So when you came in there, was the thought help compliance, I use the word internally and externally,
Yes.
was that the right?
Yes.
And is that role still the same today,
Yes.
where it's
Yes.
kind of doing both?
Yes.
Ultimately.
So I have internal responsibilities. I'm MLRO, I'm Data Protection Officer, but I still continue my compliance advisory work, which is the work that I love doing.
And I imagine that just continues on a year-on-year basis to get more and more just
and
working.
it's so varied, across the whole of the financial services sector, touching on the e-gaming sector sometimes, the designated businesses sometimes, but it's just requires you to be really sharp in your knowledge, really ahead of your clients. Don't pay you to learn something because they've asked you. They expect you to know it. And that takes a huge amount of personal investment, so I'm passionate about it.
That was one of the questions I had really about that, because it changes so regularly, the space, that you have to be kind of on point continually.
And it's not just Isle of Man. You have to look at what the Channel Islands are doing, what the UK is doing, and just kind of have that horizon scan going on all the time, so that the client doesn't come to you and say, what does this mean for our business, and you say, I didn't know about that. That's not a good place to be. Right. So for example, when FATCA started bubbling about, I was saying, right, I've got to get myself educated on this, because this looks like something that would impact on our clients. So, and all the UK stuff like the Criminal Finances Act, and that has extraterritorial reach, and it's about just making sure that you're really going to add a value to your client.
For somebody interested in getting into compliance, obviously I'm sure you'd say it's the greatest thing ever, but
I might be one of a few.
I presume you just encourage people to go and get educated around, go and get professional qualifications, and I guess find a company to provide that basis.
I think the professional qualifications are good.
Practical.
Personally, I don't think they ever replace
practical experience.
So if I was recruiting into my regulatory compliance advisory team, I would be looking for someone who'd sat in the seat at least, and understood what it's like. So that's where someone can really add value to compliance advisory work, because you have credibility with the client. If you haven't got that practical experience, then it's a little bit less attractive to the client, because you need that trust. You need the client to trust what you're saying and place that reliance, and not think, oh gosh, I think I'm going to go and get a second opinion.
It's again, as an observer of compliance, how I suppose it is about money laundering, but that's the very much, I guess, not old way, but it's just so broad now, the context of compliance.
Absolutely.
Isn't it, that you have to have so many strings to your bow, I guess.
It depends, on the nature of where you work, but it will be AML, it will be anti-bribery, it will be data protection, it will be the rule book, it will be FSA guidance, it could be FATCA and CRS, so there's an awful lot of pillars to a compliance role, which, wind back to when I started in 95, it was primarily AML, because that's really all there was, and there was a little bit of prudential, and there was a little bit of conduct of business, but we've morphed to a situation where you need to be all things to all men in a compliance role, unless your business is big enough and wealthy enough to have separate MROs, separate data protection officer, separate compliance officer, etc. So,
how many do you have in your team now?
There's 3 of us in total. So there's myself, there's Mike Nudd, who's a consultant, who joined us from Equium, and we have a trainee, Catherine Sharman, who did a law degree, but she created her own luck because she came to us on work experience and said to me, I really like what you do, and maybe one day I'll come. And so when we identified that we needed a trainee, I thought, right, she created her own luck for me. So I really like that about people.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
So on the previous podcast, we were chatting to Jennifer, who heads up the Institute of Directors, and we were talking about the boards and the dynamics of boards and the governance around boards. I guess do you see more and more, and obviously it should be anyway, but that not independence on the board, but that compliance head that's in the room with not the directors aren't compliance or governance orientated, but having maybe that independence, that I presume you feel that's an important part when you're looking at board composition.
Yeah.
Compliance are either in there or very much heard in the room.
Yeah, and having the collective round the table who understand that everyone's responsible for it. It's not just the compliance officer. So hearing directors saying, well, it's not really my area and I don't really know, and I don't really read the report very much in depth, is putting themselves in a really precarious position these days because the regulatory responsibility sits with all directors. It's specialised in maybe the head of compliance, but everyone needs to be sort of on top of it. Yeah.
So mentioned earlier about kind of perhaps initially when compliance was sort of maybe my observations more than other people, the compliance initially was just, it was very much focused on people money laundering or sophistication of getting. Obviously, it's such a broader scope now, but if you take it back to those earlier that earlier concept of money laundering, and obviously a lot of it's about that sophistication and that development. I assume that's again another area that you have to continue to ultimately try and keep up with, as they say, with the criminals are probably the most sophisticated people around. So that, I presume that's a continued challenge. And with, I think about, say, cryptocurrency, an example, which is just another dynamic to the whole situation that must provide a lot of challenges.
Yeah, it does. And, I feel for the entities that are there trying to do their best to identify these things, and sometimes it can go very wrong. But that's where I think the personal investment of time needs to happen. Someone within the business needs to be understanding the risks. But I do appreciate that, when you're a compliance officer in a regulated entity, you maybe don't have the time that we do to sit down and read a FATFA paper on virtual assets or whatever else. So that's where we feel it's important to add value by taking that, demystifying it, turning it into something that's edible and digestible, that will keep the compliance fraternity up to date, I suppose, in as an easy way as possible. Yeah.
One of the stats I was reading, is it Fenago? Have you come across them? I think they provide compliance services, but they talked about in the last 10 years that there'd been £26 billion worth of fines to non-compliance around money laundering, which when you think of that number is just staggering.
We're seeing that trend on the island. If you go back to the early enforcement days and you monitor the trends and you look at the frequency is increasing. And, it's not a nice place for any regulated entity to have a public statement made about them and a public fine and everything else. But this is what's happening. And I think that should be top of a board agenda. It should be sharpening the mind, but I think maybe there are some who think, oh, well, we're low risk and it's not going to happen to us and all the rest. So, unfortunately, I don't think anyone goes out of their way to not comply, but they might just let things slide to an extent that actually over time it doesn't look so great. Yeah, no, but
it's easy to compare yourself to others and therefore think, well, that's higher risk, we're lower, we don't need to be as, like you say, things end up slipping a little bit. So outside of the day-to-day job, director and chair of the consultation committee, what's involved in that?
So, I'm one of the directors of the local compliance association. To be honest, the chair of the consultation committee isn't the most, busy role. it would be if there was lots of consultation going on, but the volume of consultation, I think, has been impacted by COVID, and the regulators' focus being on other things. So it just means going out to the membership and basically saying, right, there's this that could impact on the compliance profession. Let me have any views, and also thinking about it from the context of a compliance professional.
And will you go and represent the community?
Well, we would certainly submit our comments to whoever it was that was consulting on behalf of the compliance community. And as a director, I get involved in the CPD events that we do, get involved in thinking about membership. So we're quite a small team of directors on that association, but we're very passionate about making sure that we're representing the compliance community.
And how do you find, Shay, it's not going to be now, but in regard to dealing with the regulator and that line of communication, again, you might listen to other jurisdictions, but particularly when we talk about the Isle of Man, how do you find them?
So the FSA are accessible, which we hear from other jurisdictions, say the UK, that they're not particularly accessible. I think them and me have been round the block long enough to have a mutual respect for each other, I hope. We will always act in our clients' best interests, and sometimes we do have some discussions with the FSA about what those best interests might be, but I think they value the importance that we place on compliance and how much we want to help our clients get to the right place, and that can sometimes involve quite challenging discussions between us and the FSA on behalf of our clients, but I think we're all heading in the same direction. It's just sometimes we need some clarity on how they're thinking and what they're thinking. But I think we've been both in our respective fields for long enough that we're good with each other.
No, that's good.
I hope.
And I know, again, talking about outside of work, you do work with Samaritans.
I do.
So how did that come about? What's involved?
So when I moved here in 1992, I decided I needed to do something which would enable me to meet some people outside of work. And I thought to myself, the first thing I see that I can do, I'm going to do. And there was an advert in the paper for Samaritan volunteers, and I said, yeah, I'll do that.
Right.
My husband at the time and my parents were like, pardon, that is the worst thing you could possibly do. It won't suit you. So I joined in 94, stayed till 96, took 13 years off to bring up my son, and then went back in 2009. So I've been a listening volunteer ever since.
Right.
I also have other roles in the branch. Funnily enough, I'm the trustee for compliance and data protection, as you would expect. But it's something that I feel very privileged to do.
Okay. Yeah. Again, funny enough, going back to the last podcast when we were chatting to Jennifer, she does volunteer work, and she talked about how probably better to go and listen to the episode for the way she describes it, but just that, I suppose, just that feel of giving and helping.
It's extremely fulfilling. And the nature of the work that we do, when you are listening to someone who is maybe not having the best of days or the best of times, and shares that with you, it's very privileged. It's, they often say, how do you do this? And I often say, well, how do you do what you're doing? Picking up the phone and talking to a stranger about something that's really bothering you. That's quite courageous. I just sit on the other end of the phone. But I really, really, really enjoy what I do, and I'm passionate about it. I'm very fortunate that my husband's a volunteer as well, and that that means that we can really devote a lot of time to it. And we both do. I can't ever see myself not doing it.
Not helping them out. Okay, so just to go back to the DQ, they're called Dr. Quinn then, and the present climate obviously being strange with COVID. How have you found that, or how have the business found that? And then I suppose developing that on, is the business doing things to adapt to a more of a an online future as well, that is inevitably all businesses are looking at?
So early on in lockdown, we actually hosted virtual get-togethers for the compliance profession, because we thought that was quite important to do. There was no sort of motivation to that other than give compliance professionals an opportunity to come together in a virtual way. So we used Zoom, the conferencing facility. We had 80 compliance professionals from across the industry come together just to talk about the challenges that they were facing, and we facilitated that and enabled them to talk to each other.
And was there common themes in there, I assume?
There were lots of common themes, and we published a summary paper at the end, and the feedback we got from the compliance community was just thanks for giving us the opportunity to just talk to other compliance professionals about the challenges they were facing. So that was one thing we did. Some of the work that we do, we had to change our way of working, so we found new ways of using technology to do the outsourced compliance monitoring that we do, some of the project work we were doing. So, traditionally we would have gone on client premises to do that work. We didn't have to, which was good. And then I think the third thing, which really does predate COVID, but sort of chimed really well from a timing perspective, is we've developed a new e-learning platform, which will enable clients initially in the TCSP sector to do e-learning online across 4 key regulatory topics, with more to come. So it did start life well before the pandemic, but I think now from a timing perspective it's worked out really well for us.
And how's that subscription based?
Yes, it is subscription based, and we're running some demos this week and next week, and we've had some great feedback so far from clients too. I
presume you can log in and watch them at times that fit.
It's so you can log in. This executive course that's tablet friendly, for those directors who don't particularly want to do it during working hours and prefer doing it on a Friday with a glass of wine.
I think the feeling, certainly I've seen more out of COVID, because everyone's worked from home, that this work-life balance has kind of changed, so people might want to be doing CPD at 10 o'clock at night.
I mean, when we started, we were envisaging directors sitting in London City Airport doing their anti-money laundering training on their mobile, but not so much now.
No, it's a glass of wine in front of the fire.
Maybe somebody said the other day, during an episode of Line of Duty that my wife's watching, which I took exception to because I'm a huge Line of Duty fan. So it's like, no. But yeah, that's the intention, is that the executive level and the operational level will be quite different, and there's testing functionality in there as well, and analysis functionality in there. So it seems to be sitting well so far with clients. So we're really excited about it and looking forward to developing more content, developing some micro learning that clients can do, particularly MLROs, instant learning kind of stuff. So, it's good. And
to loop back, because we were talking about COVID and back to the Samaritans, how's that situation? Because obviously people are going through, a lot of people are going through a difficult time. I assume and you hear a lot of charities are struggling for funding because everyone's obviously naturally tighter with their funds. But the flip side is they need places like the Samaritans probably more than ever. I assume that's a hard balance at the moment. Yeah,
I mean, we're very lucky on the funding side. On Ireland, we're very financially okay, which is great. The
more calls, I assume, during this period.
And the issues that we had was more calls coupled with volunteers actually having to self-isolate during lockdown or shield. So making sure that we continue to be there. It was quite unusual because normally you go on shift and you hear about a variety of things. Some of them might be things you've experienced, some of them not. But in the early days of lockdown, say March, April, every single call was about the virus, everything. And so you're dealing with that yourself at home in your work, and then you're going on shift, and we were doubling up on our shifts, and we're only expected to do 1 a week, but we were doing 2 just to try and manage the volume of calls. And 8 hours a week we were hearing about everyone else's worries and fears about COVID and dealing with our own. But the support system within Samaritans is phenomenal, and that's the only way that we could have done that.
When were the Samaritans first?
1953.
Right, okay.
That's when they were founded, and they established here in 1979. So we're here 41 years. This month actually.
Right,
so,
okay.
It's a great organisation.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming in today and having a chat. It's very much appreciated. If people want to reach out to you, if you don't mind, we'll add your LinkedIn profile to the show notes. And I guess anyone who has any compliance orientated questions, you'd love to talk to them, wouldn't you? Or Samaritans, I'd love to talk to them.
Super, great. Thanks.
All right, thanks for joining us.
No problem.
Thank you for listening, everyone.